The court chambers smelled of wax, medicinal herbs, and wet cloth hung to dry by the fireplace. Adult women in heavy dresses whispered about children's illnesses and new fashions. Men argued about taxes and wars, and between them, copyists glided silently with thin notebooks. These notebooks contained neither reports nor prayer texts. They hid stories of desire, cunning, broken promises, and marriages based not on love, but on calculation. Too vivid, too carnal, too daring for a princess who was expected to lead an exemplary, pious life. But it was this woman, Marguerite of Navarre, who turned stories about other people's feelings into a safe way to talk about female subjectivity, in a world where any direct word could be grounds for a theological investigation. Greetings, viewers, and thank you for your attention. Imagine the male voice of a narrator thanking you for being here, asking you to write in the comments where you are watching this story from, and which stories about court books and censorship you find most disturbing. This voice wishes you a calm but attentive listening experience and invites you to take a closer look at how a finely crafted shield against censorship was hidden behind a facade of piety and moral parables. Let's move on to the story. In official documents from the first half of the 16th century, Marguerite appears flawless. In notarial deeds, her name is accompanied by lists of lands, dowries, rights to cities, references to marriage contracts, and dynastic alliances. She is the sister of King Francis I, the wife of the King of Navarre, a mature political player involved in negotiations, a mediator between courts, a patron of humanists and reform-minded theologians. Based on these papers, one might conclude that her life was entirely consumed by rents, missions, and church matters. But at the same time, less formal evidence reveals another side to her. Handwritten circles formed around Margaret, where they discussed not only dogma, but also stories about marriage, physicality, and hypocrisy. France at this time was living in a tense balance. Printing presses were already flooding the market with books. Universities were discussing new commentaries on scripture, and port cities were selling banned treatises brought in from German lands. At the same time, the Sorbonne in Paris and its associated theological structures were carefully searching for any phrase that might seem questionable. Catalogues of condemned books are being expanded. Academic conclusions against authors are being drawn up, and cases are being brought against suspicious readers. Several high-profile trials and burned books have shown all educated people that a text that touches on faith and the body is dangerous, regardless of the author's intentions. Marguerite encountered this system even before the Heptameron. Her religious work on inner faith irritated theologians. It was too personal in tone, too bold in its discussion of the relationship between man and God, and did not emphasize the authority of the Church enough. University conclusions hinted at dangerous tendencies, and the Sorbonne was ready to label the work as suspicious. Her status saved her from outright persecution. The intervention of her brother, the king, and her position as a princess made open persecution politically risky. But it became clear that any word could be taken out of context and used against her as evidence. Against this backdrop, the form of the novella collection becomes not entertainment, but a survival strategy. The Heptameron outwardly imitates the old model. A group of adult men and women, detained on their way, pass the time with stories. Inside, another task is hidden. The stories depict marriages based on calculation, situations of violence and coercion, clergy covering up personal interests with religious language, and the subtle resistance of women in conditions where their bodies and honor are turned into a pledge of union between families. Each story has a moral framework. Formally, vice is punished and virtue is rewarded. However, for readers familiar with court life, it is obvious that beneath the label of instruction lies a critique of hypocrisy. The handwritten form of the Heptameron is key here. The collection does not circulate on market stalls, but in limited court circles. The slim volumes pass from office to office, from chamber to chamber, sometimes leaving a trace in library inventories, but more often remaining invisible to official bureaucracy. They are read by adult men and women who are accustomed to caution in their statements. It is obvious to them that stories where a pious facade covers abuse of power do not refer to an abstract world, but to their own reality, to marriage contracts, to the practice of patronage, to the behavior of clergy at court. The censorship perspective of the era views such texts differently. For a theologian accustomed to working with treatises, a set of themes is important: descriptions of desire, the conflict between marriage and attraction, criticism of the behavior of clergy. This is enough to raise alarm bells. The author's status makes the blow harder, but does not negate the alarm. The phrase, "too bold for a princess," in their logic, means not praise, but risk. If such a collection becomes widely known, it could undermine trust in church institutions and in marriage as the foundation of society. Margaret builds several levels of defense. The stories can be read as a catalogue of examples, showing the consequences of sin and cunning. The balance of episodes is such that stories of fidelity and steadfastness stand alongside stories of transgression. Any accuser, wishing to present the collection as corrupting, inevitably faces the fact that the text can just as convincingly be declared moralizing. Finally, her position in the political system makes any possible denunciation a matter not only of faith, but also of diplomacy. A blow to her reputation is a blow to the prestige of the entire house. A myth that arose later simplified the picture. It is easier to say that the princess wrote 2 daring stories about love, giving the court indecent reading. In this version, the tension with theologians disappears. Her participation in the defense of reform-minded authors is smoothed over, and her political role is leveled. The documents, letters, acts, lists of banned books show a woman living under constant pressure. She is ill, endures difficult childbirth, survives epidemics, negotiates the fate of cities, and tries to protect people suspected of deviating from official doctrine. Against this backdrop, the Heptameron appears not as a frivolous whim, but as a deliberate way to preserve the right to speak about women's experiences without coming under direct attack from inquisitorial structures. It is this duality, the external facade of a moral collection and the internal work with themes of power, the body, and hypocrisy, that makes Margarita's story disturbing and contemporary. In an era when the printing press turns any word into potential evidence, and university theology departments consider themselves the guardians of the boundaries of what is permissible, the Princess and Queen of Navarre uses an old form of storytelling to write what could not be said directly. Later, censors and publishers would try to tame her text, turning it into a safe parable, but the original intention is still visible in the manuscript layers: to give a voice to those whom notarial deeds refer to only by the numbers of their dowries and the names of their estates. And the more closely one looks at how the Heptameron entered court circles, the clearer it becomes that the text lived in 2 realities at once: in the reality of printed decrees, where any word could become evidence, and in the reality of private salons, where adult women allowed themselves to discuss their own experiences for the first time, cautiously, behind the screen of fictional stories. Handwritten notebooks passed from hand to hand almost secretly. They were not displayed or read aloud at large gatherings. They lay on tables next to schedules of audiences, diplomatic letters, and court reports. In these same rooms, marriage contracts and dowries, the distribution of judicial offices, and the fate of cities were discussed. And here, quietly, they read Margarita's novellas, where the cunning of women, the abuses of clergy, marital deception, and the complexity of human desire were presented not as a challenge to the norm, but as a reality known to almost all adults at court. During this same period, censorship became increasingly harsh. Parisian theologians were accustomed to seeing a threat in any text that discussed the body, passion, and women's choices. At trials, phrases such as undermining morals, temptation, and unbecoming of the author's rank were heard. For male scholars, such stories seemed dangerous, not because of their explicit content, but because they allowed women to speak about subjectivity. If a princess discusses the lies of her confessor, the cruelty of her husband, or the cunning of a courtier, it means that the world, where women's voices are limited to the domestic sphere, is cracking. The observations of theologians rarely made it into official records, but they were preserved in academic letters. There, the very form of the text was discussed. Why does a woman of high birth take her cue from Boccaccio? Is there a dangerous hint of ambiguity hidden in the instructive stories? Does this collection undermine trust in the clergy? At the same time, those in power were well aware that accusations of sinful audacity could be used against anyone, and not always for reasons of faith. Often, it was a political tool, a way to put pressure on those who supported reformers or interfered with the interests of influential families. Marguerite felt this double threat. Her status protected her from direct persecution, but made her vulnerable to gossip, intrigue, and theological denunciations. Her every move was recorded in letters and documents, and her every writing was read through the prism of suspicion. She saw how quickly any word could become a weapon in politically tense France. One need only recall the fate of several authors who were banned or exiled for a single treatise. Nevertheless, it was during this time that Marguerite continued to collect stories, rework other people's plots, and write new ones. She did this slowly, cautiously, but consistently. Novellas served as a way for her to talk about things that could not be discussed in political letters or theological treatises. Women's vulnerability in marriage, power games in monasteries, the false holiness of certain clergymen, women's dependence on men's decisions. All of this is placed within a parable, within a moralistic framework that makes the text seem harmless on the surface. Gradually, a network of readers formed around the Heptameron, expressing not only compliments but also fear. Some saw the text as a moral lesson. Others saw it as a dangerous example of a princess allowing herself to criticize the established order. Others see it as evidence that women read and write differently than court etiquette allows. It is this tension that makes the text electric. Every reader understands that they are holding not just a collection of stories, but a document of the era, where lively criticism of court hypocrisy is hidden under a layer of morality. Meanwhile, a theological struggle is brewing around the court. The Sorbonne is trying to expand its control over books. New lists of banned texts are being discussed, and anxiety about the influence of reformist ideas is growing. Preachers speak of women's writings, which are supposedly capable of corrupting the reader's mind with soft rhetoric. This rhetoric is no accident. The female voice in literature undermined the established system of control, and therefore became the object of suspicion even before it was read. Margarita, realizing that her words could be brought to trial, introduces another layer of protection. Her characters do not speak on her behalf, but as interlocutors representing different points of view. Their moral conclusions seem straightforward, but the plots themselves reveal the stratification of society, where the word sin is used as an instrument of power and virtue as a decoration without practical weight. For adult readers, these contrasts were obvious. For the censor, they were a reason to keep their distance. And yet, despite the risk, the Heptameron continues to exist. In manuscripts, in excerpts, in fragments. It is copied, but not widely printed. It is discussed, but not officially judged. Thus, the text lives in the shadow of the state apparatus, simultaneously protected by the status of its author and under constant threat. And as the story moves forward, it becomes clear that it is precisely this duality, the moralistic mask and hidden criticism, that makes the Heptameron a key document of the era, a way of speaking the truth so that the censor sees a parable, and the attentive reader sees the experience of a woman who found a loophole within a rigid system of control. When Marguerite's manuscripts began to spread beyond the narrow circle of court readers, the pressure on them became noticeably tougher. Theological notes increasingly referred to overly bold stories that supposedly blurred the distinction between what was permissible and what was dangerous. These accusations were almost always accompanied by the same implication. If the text was written by an adult woman of high standing, then any freedom in it automatically looked suspicious. This approach allowed critics to avoid discussing the content and instead attack the very possibility of female authorship. It is at this point that sin becomes a tool for combating uncomfortable ideas. Each novella is examined under a magnifying glass, singling out places where the abuses of clergy are ridiculed, where hypocritical holiness or the double standards of men in power are shown. To hide their irritation at this criticism, theologians prefer to talk not about the topicality of the plots, but about the allegedly cunning description of desire. But the manuscripts that have survived to this day show the opposite. Marguerite uses the theme of temptation as a screen on which to examine social injustice. The parable of the cunning woman most often hides a story of abuse of office, while the story of the deceitful spouse is an analysis of the cynicism of marriage contracts. The more deeply the king's scholarly advisors looked into these texts, the better they understood that there was no direct reason for a court ban. Officially, the novellas speak of morality. Formally, they condemn vices. Outwardly, they resemble old instructive collections, but inside them lives the tense truth of the era. Court marriages are concluded for profit. Confessors take advantage of the trust of the laity, and women are forced to be cunning in order to survive in a structure where almost every law is written by men and for men. This hidden content became the main source of irritation. Some theologians tried to convince the king's entourage that such stories feed the spirit of doubt. They referred to the danger of spreading stories in which clergymen appear to be as prone to weakness as laymen. At the same time, they rarely acknowledged that the same court circles secretly read Boccaccio, Petrarch, and entire collections of Italian novellas, which contained many times more satire. But Marguerite had one peculiarity that made her position delicate. She wrote as a woman, and this automatically turned any everyday story into a political gesture. If a man ridicules the vices of society, it is wit. If a woman does the same, it crosses the line of what is permissible. That is why every discussion of her text was accompanied by the question of power. Meanwhile, the circle of readers expanded. The novellas were read in Bordeaux, Lyon, and Paris. Sometimes they were copied with abridgments, sometimes with cautious comments in the margins. Several copies are accompanied by remarks from officials who note that the text is useful for instruction, if read from the right perspective. Such permissive notes were an attempt to protect themselves. They allowed them to recognize the value of the book without coming into conflict with theologians who saw it as a threat. And yet the pressure only intensified. Increased censorship after religious conflicts made any work a potential target. Margarita was not discussed openly, but closely. The circles where her works were read and the people who quoted her were monitored. In official documents, she was referred to as a pious princess, but in private letters, she was called overly observant and too perceptive of human nature. This veiled irritation was a symptom of the times. In an era when the authorities sought to control not only behavior, but also thought, even the parable form did not save one from suspicion. Nevertheless, the Heptameron continued its slow, almost underground movement. It passed through the hands of those who sought an honest view of court hypocrisy, and those who saw in the novellas convenient material for moralizing lessons. And along with this, a double meaning of the text was formed. Each reader saw what they could bear, a superficial moral conclusion, or the very hidden criticism that Marguerite had written under the layer of the parable, where it seemed that the discussion of Margarita was moving into the phase of accusations. A quiet shift took place. Instead of direct prohibitions, recommendations to treat with caution appeared, and instead of a formal investigation, there were unofficial discussions in theological schools. Such subtlety was more dangerous than open persecution, because it turned the author into a figure who was observed but not accused. Her name was rarely mentioned, but the very fact of the appearance of the novellas became a reason for treatises on the limits of what was permissible. These texts carefully noted that women's hands should not touch dangerous topics, and then added in the footnotes, if such stories exist, they should only be read by mature minds. This caveat smacked of an attempt to maintain control. Censors could not delete a work that did not directly violate dogma, but they could limit its readership. In one of the handwritten lists, the censors added a note about inappropriate attention to the cunning of women, emphasizing that such plots could incite disobedience. At the same time, the same readers freely quoted Italian novellas, where deception and trickery are presented much more sharply. The difference lay in the status of the author. When a courtwoman showed how power over the body and reputation actually worked, the text became not just literature, but a commentary on the structure of the court itself. Meanwhile, religious tensions within the kingdom were growing. After a series of conflicts, officials sought to control everything, from sermons to the statutes of craft guilds. In such conditions, any work that offered a new perspective on morality risked coming under suspicion. This was especially true if it showed how clergymen took advantage of their position, how rich men circumvented their own rules, and how women in this system were forced to survive through wit and caution. The manuscripts of Margarita were overshadowed by theological denunciations. Formally, there was nothing to denounce because the novellas did not violate dogma. But the very idea that a woman of courtly status could describe the world with such attention to human weaknesses was perceived as a challenge. The denunciations spoke of dangerous observation, of Margarita's ability to recognize hypocrisy where the church preferred to see sin. Such wording allowed critics not to accuse her openly, but to create an atmosphere of expectation, as if the author had already done something unacceptable. During this period, a peculiar zone of silence arose around the Heptameron. It was not banned, but it was not encouraged either. It was read, but not discussed aloud. It circulated in court circles as an object that was both dangerous and indispensable, too honest to ignore its value, and too truthful to easily fit into strict morality. Censors preferred to talk about the benefits of moderate instruction, trying to keep the text within the safe boundaries of edification. But anyone who read more carefully could see that the parable worked both ways. It taught, but it also exposed. This hidden tension made the book's continued existence almost a feat. Within the court, there remained many who understood the value of the text. They copied it by hand, added cautious remarks, and sometimes even defended the novellas in private conversations. They saw not licentiousness, but a document of the era, a story of how power over the body, honor, and name was enshrined in the rules of marriage, in ecclesiastical courts, and in court rituals. And yet, the atmosphere around Marguerite became increasingly tense. She remained a princess, and her status protected her from direct attacks. But that same status made her texts particularly sensitive to censors. Any word from a woman of such rank could be read as a hint at the very structure of power. That is why her book moved forward cautiously, like a person who must walk between walls where the footsteps of observers can be heard. When the Heptameron later began to be read outside the narrow circles of the court, it became clear that the text had survived both pressure and suspicion. It was preserved not because of the mercy of the censors, but because adult readers saw in it not the freedom of a princess, but a mirror of their own fears. The novellas showed a world where honor could be lost faster than property, where power over reputation was more dangerous than any punishment, where women developed survival strategies, not through defiance, but through observation, caution, and the ability to read the intentions of the powerful. It was precisely this, not courage, but the ability to see, that made the text uncomfortable for those who sought to control morality. Meanwhile, the religious and political situation continued to change. The strengthening of church discipline, pressure from theological faculties, and growing anxiety about Reformation movements all turned any attempt to discuss human behavior into a potential threat. Marguerite's novellas became a kind of textbook on how people use the rules that are supposed to limit their desires. Here, clergy could abuse trust, authorities could manipulate confession, men could hide behind religion to conceal their own hypocrisy. For readers, it was recognizable. For institutions, it was too dangerous. At the same time, no formal accusations were ever made against the book. Instead of a ban, a strategy of moral encirclement was adopted. The text was declared useful only upon mature reflection. Public discussion of it was avoided. Access to manuscripts was restricted, and conversations were steered toward topics of humility and virtue. This created a barrier that did not openly destroy the text, but pushed it to the periphery of cultural life. But it was precisely this periphery that became the place where the novellas began to live their own life. They were read by adult men and women who were not involved in court intrigues and saw them as a document of the era, not a dangerous hint. Over time, a stable double layer appeared in the interpretation of the Heptameron. On the outside, it looked like a collection of edifying stories intended to strengthen morality, but inside, it contained a subtle anatomy of power, fear, and hypocrisy. Marguerite managed to create a text that adapted to the demands of the era without losing its sharpness. It could be read as a parable, as evidence of how honor and reputation really work, or as a hidden commentary on the very structure of court life. Her status played a decisive role in the book's survival. It was formally impossible to persecute the princess, risky to accuse her directly, and unrealistic to silence the text completely. Therefore, a compromise was reached. The book was recognized as suitable for instruction, although those who knew the context understood that it spoke of much more painful things. This compromise allowed the Heptameron to survive for decades without disappearing or becoming a weapon against its creator. The ending of this story is neither loud nor heroic. It is as quiet as the footsteps of an author who walked the line of what was permissible. Margarita died without ever seeing her work published openly during her lifetime, but her manuscripts continued to be copied by adults who understood the value of courage disguised as moral instruction. And today, it is clear that the most important effect is not that the text withstood the pressure, but that it showed that even within the rigid framework of moral control, it is possible to talk about human cunning, pain, fear, and desire in such a way that the truth sounds louder than prohibitions.